Imagine the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific Ocean, a shimmering blue canvas stretching to the horizon under a relentless sun. It's early June 1942, and beneath those waves, tension coils like a spring ready to snap. In the dim glow of chart rooms aboard American aircraft carriers, sailors hunch over maps, their faces etched with determination and quiet fear. Far to the west, a massive Japanese armada slices through the sea, confident in their invincibility after months of conquest. But hidden in the shadows of code-breaking genius and sheer audacity, the United States Navy is about to turn the tide of World War II. This is the story of the Battle of Midway, the ambush that sank Japan's mighty carriers and shattered their dreams of Pacific dominance. A clash where luck, bravery, and intelligence collided in a symphony of fire and steel, forever altering the course of history. To understand the thunderclap that was Midway, we must rewind the clock to the dark days of December 1941. The world was already ablaze with war, Europe gripped by Hitler's iron fist, cities crumbling under bombs, but in the Pacific, a storm was brewing. Japan, an island nation starved for resources, had set its sights on empire. Oil, rubber, tin, these were the lifeblood they craved, locked away in the colonies of European powers weakened by the fight against Germany. Under the command of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist who had studied at Harvard and knew the sleeping giant that was America all too well, Japan plotted a daring strike to cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet and buy time for their conquests. On a sleepy Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, the skies over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, darkened with the roar of 353 Japanese aircraft. Launched from 6 carriers hidden 230 miles north, they came in waves, torpedo bombers skimming low over the water, dive bombers screaming from above, Zeros strafing with machine gun fire. Battleship Row erupted in chaos. The USS Arizona, a proud symbol of American naval power, took a bomb straight down her stack, igniting her forward magazines in a cataclysmic explosion that killed 1,177 men in an instant. Black smoke billowed like funeral pyres, oil-slicked waters burned, and the air filled with the acrid stench of cordite and burning fuel. All of a sudden, there was a big explosion, recalled one survivor, Seaman First Class Donald Stratton, who clung to a line thrown from a nearby ship, his hands seared by flames as he pulled himself to safety. The whole bow of the Arizona came up out of the water. It was just unbelievable. Pearl Harbor was a tactical triumph for Japan. 8 battleships damaged or sunk, 188 aircraft destroyed, over 2,400 Americans dead, but it was a strategic blunder. Yamamoto himself had warned, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." And awaken it did. The attack unified a divided America, propelling the nation into war with a fervor that would fuel an industrial machine unmatched in history. Factories hummed day and night, churning out ships, planes, and weapons at a pace Japan could never hope to rival. But in those early months, the tide flowed eastward. Japanese forces swept through the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, capturing vital oil fields and humiliating Allied armies. General Douglas MacArthur fled Corregidor with his famous vow, "I shall return," leaving behind tales of desperate resistance like the Bataan Death March, where exhausted American and Filipino prisoners trudged under brutal sun, bayoneted if they fell. Yet even as Japan celebrated its string of victories, cracks began to show. In April 1942, a daring raid led by Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy DeLittle shattered the illusion of invincibility. 16 B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier USS Hornet in a feat of engineering audacity, bombed Tokyo and other cities. The damage was minimal, a few factories hit, some civilians killed, but the psychological blow was immense. For the first time, war touched the Japanese homeland. Emperor Hirohito's palace gardens were spared, but the raid exposed vulnerabilities. "The enemy has come," blared Japanese radio, stirring fear and outrage. Yamamoto, already planning to extend Japan's defensive perimeter, saw Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of sand 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii, as the key. Capture it, and Japan could threaten Pearl Harbor directly, luring out the remnants of the U.S. fleet for a decisive blow. Midway was also a stepping stone to Hawaii, and its airfields could spot American movements. But Yamamoto's plan, Operation MI, was ambitious to a fault. A massive fleet dispersed across the ocean, including a diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands to split U.S. forces. What Yamamoto didn't know was that his codes were compromised. In the bowels of a Pearl Harbor basement known as Station HYPO, a team of cryptanalysts led by Commander Joseph Rochefort worked tirelessly. They had partially broken JN-25, the Japanese naval code, piecing together fragments like a jigsaw puzzle from hell. Rochefort, a rumpled genius who often worked in his bathrobe, smoked endlessly and slept little, deduced the target. To confirm, they tricked the Japanese. Midway's garrison sent a fake message about a freshwater shortage, and sure enough, intercepted traffic reported AF low on water. AF was Midway. That was the clincher, Rochefort later said. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the steely commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, trusted the intelligence. Had we lacked early information of the Japanese movement, Nimitz reflected, we would have been in a rather unhealthy situation. Nimitz moved swiftly. The USS Yorktown, battered in the recent Battle of the Coral Sea, where US forces had halted a Japanese advance on Port Moresby, New Guinea, at the cost of the carrier Lexington, limped back to Pearl. In a Herculean effort, 1,400 workers swarmed her dry dock, welding and repairing around the clock. What should have taken months was done in 72 hours. It was a miracle, one shipyard worker recalled, the clang of hammers and hiss of torches echoing through the night. Yorktown sailed out, patched but ready, joining Task Force 16, the Enterprise and Hornet, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a quiet tactician stepping in for the ailing Bill Halsey. Fletcher commanded overall from Yorktown. Together, they mustered 3 carriers, 234 aircraft, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers, a fraction of Japan's force, but positioned for ambush northeast of Midway, dubbed Point Luck. Meanwhile, the Japanese juggernaut steamed on. Yamamoto's fleet was a behemoth. For fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, all veterans of Pearl Harbor, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, with 248 planes. Battleships, including the mighty Yamato, lurked far behind, along with cruisers, destroyers, and invasion transports carrying 5,000 troops. The Aleutians diversion began on June 3rd, with bombings on Dutch Harbor, but it failed to draw Nimitz away. He knew the real prize was Midway. As the sun rose on June 3rd, American PBY Catalina flying boats droned over the ocean, their crews scanning for the enemy. At 9:04 a.m., one spotted the invasion force 700 miles west, many ships, course 090, speed 9. The noose was tightening. That night, tension gripped both sides. On Midway Atoll, a coral ring barely 2 miles across, Marines dug in amid sand dunes and Guinea birds. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon, commanding the ground forces, fortified with anti-aircraft guns, tanks, and wire. We were ready as we could be, he later wrote in his log, the salty breeze carrying the distant rumble of waves. Aboard the carriers, pilots like Ensign George Gay of Torpedo Squadron 8 on Hornet sharpened their nerves with coffee and cigarettes. Gay, a Texan with a drawl, joked with his crew, but inside, he knew the odds. Japanese torpedoes ran true. American Mark 13s often dudded or ran erratic. We were expendable, Gay would say. As dawn broke on June 4, 1942, the stage was set. At 4:30 a.m., Nagumo launched 108 planes toward Midway, 36 Val dive bombers, 36 Kate torpedo bombers, escorted by 36 Eurofighters. The air vibrated with engines as they formed up, the rising sun glinting off their wings. Mitsuo Fuchida, the ace who led the Pearl Harbor strike, watched from Akagi's bridge, nursing an appendicitis but eager for glory. The sky was clear, he recalled, and visibility unlimited. But American radar picked them up 93 miles out. Sirens wailed on Midway. Marine fighters scrambled, outclassed Buffaloes and Wildcats against nimble Zeros. It was like shooting ducks, one Japanese pilot boasted, as 15 of 27 U.S. planes fell in flames. Bombs rained down, hangars exploded, fuel tanks ignited in orange fireballs. The whole island seemed to lift up, a Marine gunner remembered, dirt and shrapnel flying as he manned his .50 caliber. Yet Midway's runways remained operational, and the Japanese strike leader radioed back, "There is need for a second attack." Nagumo hesitated. His reserve planes were armed for ground targets, but scouts reported no U.S. ships. Then, at 7:28 a.m., a float plane spotted American vessels. 10 enemy surface ships, apparently, came the message. Nagumo's dilemma deepened. Rearm for ships or hit Midway again. He ordered the switch to torpedoes, decks cluttered with bombs and fuel lines, a recipe for disaster. Meanwhile, from the American carriers, planes launched in the pre-dawn gloom. Spruance, advised by Halsey's staff, struck early at extreme range. "Attack the enemy carriers," he ordered. Torpedo bombers from Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown lumbered off, slow and vulnerable. Dive bombers followed, climbing to 20,000 feet. But coordination faltered. Groups separated in clouds and wind. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, flew straight into hell. Spotting the Japanese fleet at 9:20 a.m., Waldron dove low. Zeros pounced like hawks. They were all over us, Gay recounted, the last survivor, watching his squadron mates plunge into the sea, torpedoes missing or failing. Gay's plane hit the water. He hid under his seat cushion, witnessing the carnage from afar. Other torpedo groups fared no better. Enterprise's V-6 lost 10 of 14 planes. Yorktown's VT-3, 10 of 12. No hits. But their sacrifice drew the Japanese combat air patrol low, exhausting ammo and fuel. High above, unnoticed, came the dive bombers. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's SBD Dauntless, had pushed fuel limit searching. Spotting a Japanese destroyer's wake, he followed it like a breadcrumb trail. There they were, he said, the carriers below, decks exposed. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey's group peeled off, sirens wailing as they dove vertically. Bombs slammed into cargo, 4 hits, igniting fires that raged like infernos. The flames shot up hundreds of feet, a witness described, the carrier's hull buckling. Nearby, Akagi took 3, one amidships, detonating torpedoes in a chain reaction. Fuchida felt the deck heave. A tremendous explosion shook the ship from stem to stern. Soryu, hit by Yorktown's bombers, erupted in a fireball, her aviation fuel turning her into a pyre. In minutes, 3 carriers were doomed, black smoke mushrooming skyward, crews scrambling into oily waters amid screams and explosions. But the battle wasn't over. Hiryu, unscathed, launched a counterstrike. At noon, 18 Vals dove on Yorktown. Anti-aircraft fire blazed, traces arcing like fireworks, but 3 bombs hit. One smashed the flight deck, another ignited fires below. The ship shuddered, Captain Elliot Buckmaster recalled. Damage control teams racing with hoses amid choking smoke. Yet Yorktown's crews extinguished the blazes, and she steamed on. Then came the Kates with torpedoes. 2 struck her port side, flooding engineering spaces. Power failed. She listed heavily. Abandon ship, Buckmaster ordered. Men sliding down lines into the sea, life jackets bobbing like corks. As the sun dipped low, Enterprise launched a final strike. Dive bombers found Hiryu, hitting her with 4 bombs. Fires gutted her. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, refusing to abandon, went down with her, toasting the Emperor in a final sake. I shall remain with the ship, he said calmly, as flames licked the bridge. By nightfall on June 4th, the Pacific was littered with wreckage. Japan had lost 4 irreplaceable carriers, 248 planes, over 3,000 men. America mourned Yorktown, temporarily afloat but doomed, and 147 planes, 307 dead. But the invasion was called off. Yamamoto withdrew, his fleet shattered. This is not the end, Nimitz wired, but it was the beginning of the end for Japan's offensive dreams. Yet the drama continued. Salvage teams reboarded Yorktown on June 5th, towing her homeward. But Japanese submarine I-168 slipped through, firing torpedoes that sank her and the destroyer Haman. She went down fighting, a survivor said, as Yorktown capsized at dawn on June 7th. Midway was more than a battle. It was a pivot of fate. Codebreakers like Rochefort turned whispers into weapons. Pilots like Dick Best, who bombed 2 carriers in one day, became legends. And human stories emerged. Gay, floating amid the dead, rescued after 30 hours. Japanese prisoners, some executed in reprisal. Historian Craig Simmons called it a victory of intelligence, but it was also one of courage amid the spray and smoke. As the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the world held its breath. Japan reeled, her pilot cadre decimated. Over 100 aces lost, impossible to replace. America, blooded but unbowed, geared up for the long road to Tokyo. But what of the men who fought? The secrets they carried, the horrors they witnessed? Yet the drama continued. Salvage teams reboarded Yorktown on June 5th, towing her homeward. But Japanese submarine I-168 slipped through, firing torpedoes that sank her and the destroyer Haman. She went down fighting, a survivor said, as Yorktown capsized at dawn on June 7th. Midway was more than a battle. It was a pivot of fate. Codebreakers like Rochefort turned whispers into weapons. Pilots like Dick Best, who bombed 2 carriers in one day, became legends. And human stories emerged. Gay, floating amid the dead, rescued after 30 hours, Japanese prisoners, some executed in reprisal. Historian Craig Simmons called it a victory of intelligence, but it was also one of courage amid the spray and smoke. As the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the world held its breath. Japan reeled, her pilot cadre decimated, over 100 aces lost, impossible to replace. America, blooded but unbowed, geared up for the long road to Tokyo. But what of the men who fought? The secrets they carried, the horrors they witnessed? The morning of June 4, 1942, had ended in a funeral pyre of black smoke that could be seen for 50 miles. 3 of Japan's proudest fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning hulks, their innards gutted by American bombs. Sailors who had toasted victory only hours earlier now leapt into a sea thick with oil and blood. On Akagi's flight deck, Captain Taihiro Oroki stood amid the inferno, sword in hand, refusing to leave. "The ship is finished," he told his staff calmly, and then, as the flames closed in, he sat down cross-legged and waited for the end. Nearby, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commander of the 2nd Carrier Striking Force, raised a cup of water, he had run out of sake, to the Emperor. "Let us enjoy the beauty of the moon one last time," he said, and stayed aboard Hiryu as she too became a torch. These were not isolated gestures. Hundreds of Japanese officers chose death over surrender that day. To them, the carriers were not just steel and wood. They were living symbols of the Empire's honor. When they burned, something deeper burned with them. But the battle was not yet done. Aboard the American carriers, exhaustion mixed with a strange, almost disbelieving elation. Pilots who had expected to die were landing back on Enterprise and Hornet with fuel gauges kissing empty and bullet holes stitched through their wings. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best, Dick Best to his friends, brought his Dauntless in with a cough and a shudder. He had put 3 1,000-pound bombs into 2 different carriers in the space of 5 minutes, 1 into Akagi's flight deck, 2 more into Hiryu later that afternoon. When he climbed down from his cockpit, his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't light a cigarette. A corpsman noticed blood trickling from his nose. Best had inhaled too much of his own oxygen under pressure. The caustic soda in the system had seared his lungs. He would cough blood for the rest of his life, but on that deck, all he could say was, "I got the bastards." On Enterprise's bridge, Raymond Spruance stood motionless, binoculars still around his neck. He was not a carrierman by training. He had commanded cruisers, not air groups, but fate and Bill Halsey's gallbladder had put him in charge of the most important naval strike in American history. Spruance was quiet, almost monk-like. He spoke softly, never swore, and weighed every word. When his staff begged him to pursue the fleeing Japanese that night, he refused. "We have accomplished our mission," he said. "We will not risk the carriers in a night surface action." It was the kind of cold-blooded calculation that wins wars and infuriates glory hunters. Years later, historians would call it the decision that saved Task Force 16. Far to the west, aboard the super battleship Yamato, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the cascading reports with the calm of a man watching his own funeral from a distance. First Akagi gone, then Kaga, then Soryu, then Hiryu. Each message arrived like a hammer blow. Yamamoto had gambled everything on this operation: his prestige, his fleet, his vision of a short, decisive war. Now the heart of his carrier force lay at the bottom of the Pacific, along with the finest aircrews Japan possessed. At 1915, on June 4th, he ordered the entire Midway operation cancelled. The invasion transports, already within sight of Midway's guns, turned around and steamed west. The Aleutian force, having bombed Dutch Harbour to little effect, was left to freeze in the fog. Yamamoto did not rage. He simply stared at the chart table for a long time, then said quietly, "Leave the rest to me." That night he drafted a letter to a friend in Tokyo. "I am the only one who must apologize to His Majesty." Back at Midway Atoll itself, the Marines and sailors who had braced for invasion woke on June 5th to an eerie quiet. The expected landing barges never appeared. Instead, the horizon was littered with wreckage, life rafts, crates, bodies. Goonay birds wheeled overhead, confused by the floating debris. Colonel Harold Shannon walked the beach at sunrise, boots crunching on coral, and found a Japanese flight helmet half buried in the sand. Inside was still a lock of black hair. He turned it over in his hands, then gently placed it back in the surf. The human toll was staggering, and it was lopsided in a way no one had foreseen. Japan lost approximately 3,057 men, Exact figures are still debated because many ships took their logs to the bottom. More importantly, she lost 248 aircraft and, crucially, over 100 of her very best naval aviators. These were not rookies. These were the men who had bombed Pearl Harbor, who had sunk Prince of Wales and Repulse off Malaya, who had flown the length of the Pacific without defeat. Their average flight time was over 800 hours. The replacements waiting in Japan had fewer than 100. One Japanese pilot, Saburo Sakai, later wrote, "We had lost the war the moment those carriers went down, even if no one admitted it for 3 more years." America paid a price too. 307 men dead. 147 aircraft gone. The carrier Yorktown was still afloat on the morning of June 5th, listing but defiant, with salvage parties back aboard trying to save her. Captain Buckmaster stood on her slanting deck, smoking a pipe, watching his men rig pumps and patch holes. "She's got heart," he told a reporter who had somehow hitched a ride. But on June 6th, the Japanese submarine I-168, captained by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, threaded the destroyer screen like a ghost. At 13:31, she fired 4 torpedoes. 2 slammed into Yorktown, 1 into the destroyer Hamman alongside. Hamman broke in half and sank in 4 minutes, her depth charges exploding underwater and killing dozens of swimmers. Yorktown lingered through the night, her bow dipping lower and lower, until at 5 o'clock on June 7th she rolled over and slid beneath the waves, taking 80 more men with her. When the final tallies were in, the numbers looked almost impossible. Japan, 4 fleet carriers sunk, 1 heavy cruiser sunk, 1 heavy cruiser damaged, 248 aircraft destroyed, tilde 3057 killed. United States, 1 fleet carrier sunk, 1 destroyer sunk, 147 aircraft destroyed, 307 killed. It was, in the cold language of naval warfare, the most lopsided victory since Trafalgar. And it had been won not by superior numbers. Japan had more ships, more planes, more everything, but by intelligence, by courage, and by a handful of dive bomber pilots who found the Japanese fleet at the exact moment its guard was down. In the aftermath, the recriminations began almost immediately. In Tokyo, the Imperial Navy lied. The public was told that Midway had been an overwhelming victory, with 2 American carriers sunk and Midway's garrison annihilated. Newspapers printed triumphant headlines. Only a handful of senior officers knew the truth, and they kept it from the army, from the government, even from the emperor for weeks. When Hirohito finally learned the scale of the disaster in August, he reportedly sat in silence for a long time, then asked, "Why was I not told sooner?" In Washington and Pearl Harbor, the truth was also slow to sink in. Nimitz drafted his official report with characteristic understatement. The enemy's losses were critical. Ours, while severe, can be replaced. President Roosevelt, when briefed, simply nodded and said, "This changes everything." And it did. From that moment on, the Pacific War shifted from defense to offense. Guadalcanal would come in 2 months. Then Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the long, bloody road back. But perhaps the deepest scars were carried by the men who survived. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, was picked up by a PBY Catalina after 30 hours in the water. He had watched the entire battle from his rubber raft, hidden among the floating bodies of his squadron mates. When they hauled him aboard, he was sunburned black, dehydrated, and still clutching the little .38 revolver he'd carried in case the Japanese found him first. The first thing he asked for was a cigarette and the latest baseball scores. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, who developed the Thatch-Weave fighter tactic that saved countless American pilots, came back to Enterprise with only 4 planes out of his original squadron. He sat on the catwalk and cried, not for himself, but for the kids he'd led into the sky that morning. And then there was Joseph Rochefort. The man who had given Nimitz the gift of foreknowledge was exhausted beyond telling. He hadn't left the dungeon-like basement of Pearl Harbor for weeks. His eyes were red, his bathrobe stained with coffee and ink. When the victory was confirmed, he allowed himself one small smile, then went back to work, because the Japanese were already changing their codes again. History would eventually vindicate Rochefort, but not yet. In one of the war's great injustices, jealous rivals in Washington, chief among them the Office of Naval Intelligence, refused to believe Station HYPO had cracked the secret alone. They accused Rochefort of guesswork, blocked his promotion, and eventually shipped him off to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. He died in 1976, still wearing the Navy Cross he finally received decades after the war. At his funeral, an old codebreaker said simply, "Without Joe, There is no Midway. The sun set on June 7, 1942, over a Pacific that looked much the same as it always had, endless, indifferent, beautiful. But beneath that surface, the balance had tilted forever. Japan would fight on for 3 more brutal years, but the days of her carrier supremacy were finished before breakfast on the 4th of June. And somewhere out there, in the deep scattering of wrecks that litter the seabed northwest of Midway, lie the bones of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, silent monuments to the moment when the tide of war turned and the sleeping giant opened its eyes. The Pacific did not pause to mourn. By the time the last oil slick from Hiryu had drifted away on the trades, the war was already moving on. In Washington, the newspapers screamed victory, but the men who had lived through June 4th carried something quieter, heavier. They carried the smell of burning aviation fuel that never quite left their nostrils, the sound of friends screaming on an open radio frequency, and the image of carriers, proud cities of steel, dying in minutes. For the United States Navy, Midway was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of everything. Chester Nimitz sat alone in his office at Pearl Harbor on the evening of June 7th, reading the final casualty lists under the green glow of a banker's lamp. When he came to the name of his own son, Chester Jr., a young ensign serving on Enterprise, he allowed himself one long exhale of relief. The boy was safe. Then he turned to the Japanese losses, page after page of ships and squadrons that would never fight again, and closed the folder. Now, he said to his chief of staff, we take the war to them. Within weeks, the shipyards that had patched Yorktown in 72 impossible hours were already laying keels for new carriers, Essex-class fleet carriers that would roll off the ways like automobiles off a Detroit assembly line. 24 of them, eventually. Japan, by contrast, would complete exactly 1 fleet carrier in the same period, the Taiho, and lose her almost as quickly as she was commissioned. The math was merciless. But numbers don't bleed. People do. In the little town of Wahoo, Nebraska, a mother named Anna Waldron opened her front door on a humid afternoon in late June to find 2 naval officers in dress blues. Her son, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had led Torpedo 8 straight at the Japanese fleet without hesitation. The officers handed her a telegram. She read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it on the mantel above the fireplace next to a photograph of John in his leather flight jacket, grinning like the world belonged to him. Then she went into the kitchen and finished baking the rhubarb pie she had started that morning. Neighbors later said she never cried in front of anyone, not once. In Japan, the truth seeped out slowly, like blood through a bandage. Sailors on leave spoke in whispers about the great disaster in the Central Pacific. Families who received a wooden box instead of a son were told only that he had died gloriously for the emperor. One widow, the wife of a Kaga dive bomber pilot named Yoshio Kato, kept writing letters to her husband for 2 full years after Midway, addressing them to somewhere on the southern oceans. She never knew he had burned to death on a hangar deck when Dick Best's 1,000-pounder turned 40,000 gallons of aviation fuel into an inferno. And then there were the survivors who wished they hadn't survived. Ensign George Gay, the lone man left from Torpedo 8, became an instant celebrity when he got back to Pearl Harbor. Reporters swarmed him. Photographers wanted pictures of the sole survivor. He gave them what they wanted: smiles, jokes, the story of how he floated among the dead with nothing but a seat cushion and a prayer. But at night, alone in the BOQ, he woke up screaming, convinced he was back in the water with Zeros strafing all around him. The Navy gave him 30 days survivor's leave, a bottle of good bourbon, and orders not to talk too much. He drank the bourbon and talked anyway. For the rest of his life, he kept a small black cushion on his desk, the one that had saved him, and when schoolchildren asked him what war was like, he would only say, "It's a lot louder than you think." The Japanese Navy tried to learn the wrong lessons. Instead of admitting that American code-breaking had gutted them, they blamed Nagumo for indecision, blamed the torpedo squadrons for drawing the Zeros low, blamed the anti-aircraft gunners for poor fire discipline. Nagumo himself was not relieved. Japanese admirals were rarely sacked. Instead, he was sent south to command the remnants of the carrier force at Guadalcanal, where he would eventually slit his own belly with a samurai sword after another defeat. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Midway both, carried the guilt like a stone in his chest. In April 1943, American codebreakers would read the itinerary of his inspection flight over Bougainville, and P-38 Lightnings would rise to meet him. His Betty bomber fell in flames into the jungle, his white-gloved hands still clutching the ceremonial sword he always carried. Midway also changed the way the world thought about sea power. Battleships, the grey giants that had ruled the ocean since Trafalgar, were suddenly relics. The Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest ever built, had steamed back and forth during the entire battle without ever firing her 18-inch guns in anger. Carriers were now the new capital ships, and the men who flew from their decks were the new knights. A single pilot with a single bomb, falling almost vertically out of the sun, could decide the fate of nations. That realization settled over naval planners like a cold dawn. In the years that followed, the story of Midway grew layers of legend. Hollywood would eventually make movies, some good, some terrible, but none ever quite captured the sheer randomness of it all. How Clarence McCluskey made one last turn to the southwest when every instinct told him to head home. How Dick Best's bomb hung up on the rack for a fatal extra second, causing him to overshoot Akagi and hit Kaga instead, 2 carriers with 1 attack. How a Japanese lookout glanced up at exactly the wrong moment and saw nothing, while 30 Dauntless rolled in above the clouds. Historians still argue over the miracle question. Was Midway divine intervention, blind luck, or the inevitable triumph of better intelligence? The answer, as always, is all 3 and none. Providence, said the chaplains. Chance, said the pilots. Intelligence, said Nimitz, and he was closest to right. But even Nimitz admitted in private that no plan survives the first dive bomber. Today, if you fly far enough northwest of Hawaii, past where the charts turn pale blue and empty, you can still dive on the wrecks. Akagi lies upside down in 18,000 feet of water, her great red rising sun ensign frozen forever on the bottom of her hull. Kaga is nearby, split open like a tin can. Soryu and Hiryu rest a little farther apart, their bows pointed west, as if still trying to get home. In 1998, the submersible of the Nautico's team found Yorktown standing almost upright, her anti-aircraft guns still trained skyward, waiting for an attack that would never come again. A diver left a small American flag wedged into her railing. It is still there, silk long rotted away, the staff alone marking the spot. Every year on June 4th, a handful of survivors, fewer now, always fewer, used to gather at the Punch Bowl Cemetery in Honolulu or at the Midway Memorial on the atoll itself. They would drink a toast with whatever they had, sake or bourbon, it didn't matter. Then they would stand silent while the names were read. When George Gay died in 1994, they scattered his ashes over the waters where Torpedo 8 went in. The last man to see them die wanted to join them at last. And so the war moved on, Guadalcanal, the Marianas, Letta Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Hiroshima. Millions more would die before the Emperor finally spoke from a scratchy recording on August 15, 1945, telling his people to endure the unendurable. But every sailor, marine, and pilot who fought in those later battles knew, even if they never said it out loud, that the road to Tokyo had truly begun on a June morning in 1942, when a handful of dauntless pilots rolled in from the sun and changed the world. Stand on the flight deck of the USS Midway Museum in San Diego today and you can almost hear them. The roar of radial engines warming up, the clang of deck chains, the shouted good luck as the first plane rolls toward the catapult. Look east across the harbor and you can almost see the ghosts of Enterprise and Hornet steaming past Point Loma, flag snapping, bound for a place called Point Luck. They never came back the same. None of us did.